The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our webinar session for December 2017 on a Monday this month instead of the usual Wednesday. But hey, there's plenty of you here to join us today. So today our subject is developing naturally, which is or how not to get in a flap about bats or narked by newts. My name is Katie. I'm Digital Communication Specialist here at CABE, and I'll be helping you through this morning's session. So if you've got any questions or queries or issues that may arise throughout, you can get in touch with me and I'll help you sort those out. The way to get in touch today is you can send us questions on the question panel. It may be at the right or the top of your screen depending on the device that you're using. Just type a question in there, that'll pop up on my screen and I'll be able to answer that for you. If it's obviously regarding the content of the session, we can either answer questions as we go or potentially we'll look at combining all the questions at the end so we can have a sort of a Q&A towards the end of the session. If you're watching this on catch-up, perhaps on our YouTube channel, we do still welcome questions and you can send them through to info@cbuilde.com and again we'll pick those up for you. And we're also on Twitter, #CABECPD. So your presenter today, Dr. Stephanie Wray. Now, Stephanie is a consultant ecologist and environmental planner with 25 years experience in assessing and mitigating the effects of development on the natural environment. She currently holds non-executive roles at Tyler Grange and Biocensus and is the president of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. So what I should do, if you just give me 2 seconds, I shall hand the controls over to Stephanie and she will take you through this morning's session.
Hi, hopefully you can see my screen now.
We can, yes.
Well, brilliant. Thanks, Katie, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you here this morning, bright or early. I know I can't do both, but if you're watching this on CABE's YouTube channel and catching up, then well done. Go you for getting more sleep than the rest of us. So, as Katie said, I'm Stephanie Wray, and I'm an ecologist by training. And in case you wonder what that actually means, it's not a lifestyle choice about muesli and organic yogurt weaving. Ecology is a numerate discipline of the biological sciences. So my job involves understanding complex biological systems, working out the interrelationships between plants, animals and their environment, and then, and this is the bit relevant to most of you, I would imagine, working out what will happen to those species and those interrelationships if you change something. So what we're going to cover this morning is around the context of development, how we look at the effects of development on ecological systems and how we mitigate and offset any damaging impacts that they might be. Now, this morning, this is aimed at a non-specialist audience. I'm not going to go into great ecological detail. I'm going to give you a flavour of the particular issues as they pertain to development. And I'm also, I'm afraid, going to be quite England-centric. That's where I happen to be sitting, but I'm happy to answer questions on other regimes if that's relevant at the end. So what I'm going to talk about this morning then is shown on this slide. I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions, discussions and a general surgery for all your ecological problems. So let's just use this as a kind of general guide of where we're going to get to this morning. So I'll talk about the main legal issues that protect habitats and species and the broad types of offence that you want to avoid committing through development, and then the licences that you can request to allow lawful development. I'll cover the types of ecological survey that we can carry out and when they might be necessary. I'll talk about the impacts on different protected species, the ones that you're most likely to come across. I won't be dealing with the tentacled lagoon worm, but do feel free to ask questions about it if you're working on saline lagoons. And then we'll talk about how you can mitigate those impacts on common protected species. In those sections, I'll look at some of the seasonal constraints, the difficulty in working it into your project program and how to avoid delays. And then you might have heard of the concept of net gain in biodiversity. If you're a planner, you certainly will have done. It's in the NPPF, and I'll talk a little bit about what that involves. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the direction environmental policy is travelling in the light of Brexit and other issues, and by which point I think we'll all need a strong cup of coffee. So kicking off then with the legislation that underpins what I'm talking about. I'm simplifying significantly here, but the things you'll come across most commonly fall into two categories. Legislation that derives from the EU, such as the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, and then domestic legislation, which is primarily the Wildlife and Countryside Act, though we might talk about the Badgers Act in a little while. The Wildlife and Countryside Act was first enacted in 1981 and has been amended several times since, including most recently by the NERC Act, the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act of 2006. It still surprises me when I meet developers on site saying, well, why do I have to avoid the bird breeding season to take out this hedge? When did that become law? And they don't realize it's, you know, some 1981. It's really quite a significant amount of time that that legislation has been placed, well over 30 years, and yet hasn't seemed to have reached everybody yet. We'll talk a bit later on at the end of the webinar about Brexit, but just as a bit of a spoiler, it's not yet time to stop worrying about EU legislation. In point of fact, the UK were quite leaders in this field, and a lot of the protection of biodiversity that we see in EU directives was already here. It was already in the Wildlife and Countryside Act. There's just different schedules of species to reflect the European context and different mechanisms of reporting and enforcement. So don't expect to see too much change in the Great Repeal Bill as it was once known. Moving on then to protected sites. There's a distinct hierarchy of sites that are protected under different legal regimes. So first of all, we've got European sites that are protected under EU legislation or international convention. We've got special areas of conservation, or SACs. These are designated under the Habitats Directive for the protection of particular animals, plants or habitats which are worthy of conservation in a European context. Special protection areas, SPAs, same thing, but specifically for birds, and either a range of bird species or a specific bird species or a range of species and assemblage that's important in an EU context. Ramsar sites are important wetland sites. Some are based on habitat, some based on important assemblages of species, again, designated under the Ramsar Convention. And then together, those first three types of site on the list are what we call European sites, which contribute to the Natura 2000 network, which is a network of protected sites across the whole of Europe. And there should always be a presumption against development affecting the integrity of that network of protected sites. And we'll talk a little bit about habitats regulations assessment in a little while. Moving on then to domestic legislation, sites of national importance for nature conservation are designated as SSSIs, sites of special scientific interest. And these sites represent some irreplaceable resources like limestone pavement or ancient woodland, and some of the best examples of particular habitat types like water meadows or blanket bog in the country. So again, there's a presumption that you should avoid those sites. And then finally, we have non-statutory designated sites. You'll find those designated at a county or district level. They might be called something like sites of importance for nature conservation, SINCs, local wildlife sites, biological notification sites, and so forth. These sites don't have statutory protection, but are identified and protected through local policy, and they can be very important locally, supporting particular species, acting as a wildlife corridor, or simply acting as important green space for people within an urban environment. So don't let the idea that a site's designation being non-statutory might stop a planning inspector from finding against you. Species protection is also either at a European scale or a national scale, and there are also lists of species that are important at a single country level or local level. So for example, under the NERC Act, each country within the UK has developed a list of species and habitats of principal importance. They're called the Section 41 list of species, things that used to be called priority species. And that reflects those national differences in policy as to the species of most conservation concern. In a similar way, most local authorities will have some form of biodiversity strategy or action plan, which might list local biodiversity action plan species. And again, those are of local importance. But nonetheless, the two main types of protected species are European protected species, EPS, which protected under the two directives we've just talked about, and then nationally protected species, which are listed under schedules of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. The protections are similar for both. Again, it's the procedures, the mechanisms and penalties that are different between UK protected and European protected species. But in broad terms, these are species that it's not legal to take, to kill, to injure, to damage, disturb or disrupt access to their shelter. So here are some of the top protected species you're likely to encounter. And starting at the top left, we've got waterfalls. These are protected under UK legislation, the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So you can't capture, kill or injure them, damage, destroy or block access to their burrows, either on purpose or by not taking enough care about it. And you can't disturb them in their burrows. You might come across them in any works affecting ditches, rivers or other watercourses. In the middle, obviously, we've got badgers. They're protected under UK legislation, but under their own act, the Badgers Act of 1992. Badgers are not a species of conservation concern in the UK, but they're common and widespread. And their protection is as a result of a history of persecution through badger digging with dogs and badger baiting. They're very common present in most of lowland Britain. You can't, under the Protection of Badgers Act, damage or destroy sets where they live. You can't block access to their sets, and you can't disturb badgers in their sets. And of course, this leads to some quite strange situations where, as a developer, you would be required to move badgers to exclude them from their sets and so forth. On one side of the road, on the other side of the road, a badger control operation might be taking place for agricultural reasons, where they're seen as an agricultural pest or where there's a TB outbreak. So it's quite a strange situation with their protection. Moving on then to great crested newts. These are European protected species. So again, you can't catch, kill, injure or disturb them or destroy their place of rest or their breeding sites. On the bottom row then, we've got bats. There are 18 species of bats resident in the UK, 17 at least of which breed here. They're all insectivorous. They roost in buildings, trees and underground sites, and they rely very heavily on the habitats that surround their roosts to provide them with their insect food and to find their way around their territories by echolocation. They're protected under EU law, all species, so you can't capture, injure or kill them, damage or destroy their breeding sites, or obstruct access to their places of shelter, either recklessly or intentionally. In the middle of the bottom row, winking at you there, is a dormouse, a hazel dormouse. And there's another species of dormouse in this country, the fat dormouse, which is introduced in a whole different kettle of bananas. But hazel dormice are protected under Schedule 5 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act and Schedule 2 of the Conservation Regulations. So they're a European protected species again. So again, same rules. Can't kill them, can't damage them, can't destroy their habitats. They typically live in woodland or hedges, so any vegetation clearance or management is potentially licensable. And then finally, red squirrel. More of an issue for forestry management in Scotland. They're actually very rare in England, apart from a few places like around the northwest and northeast, Thetford Forest, the Isle of Wight, and some of the Channel Islands. So it's a Schedule 5 species. It's protected under domestic legislation. Now, there are occasions when otherwise lawful activities, such as development, will have unavoidable impacts on protected species. And in these cases, you can apply for a license to permit these otherwise unlawful acts. You get a derogation from the protection afforded by the legislation. These licenses are issued by Natural England in England, SNH in Scotland, and NRW for Wales, and they can be broadly divided into survey licenses and development licenses or mitigation licenses. So survey licenses are issued for species which might be disturbed through the act of being surveyed. For example, if you need to handle them to survey them. So, for example, you wouldn't need a license for a badger survey where you're looking just at the sets and you're not handling badgers themselves, or for looking for dormice by checking for field signs, looking for hazelnuts that have been bitten by them. But you would need a survey license for things like setting dormouse boxes or nest tubes, where you'd be actually handling the animal, or for surveying great crested newts, where you'd be setting traps and handling the animals. So it's important that you make sure that the consultants working for you have the right type of licenses for the work that you want to do and the surveys that are being carried out, and also make sure that the license number that the work was carried out under is recorded as a matter of course in any reports or applications associated with that work. For a Wildlife and Countryside Act licence, you can apply to Natural England. For European protected species, you'd still apply to Natural England delegated from DEFRA, but you'd have to follow a much more stringent process, demonstrating the lack of alternatives, the need for the development causing the impact, and how the favourable conservation status of the species would still be maintained. For badgers, you can apply for a licence to close or interfere with a set for development purposes, and consultants can now hold personal licences to supervise works close to badger sets. So where we think badgers can be retained in situ, but there's a risk of disturbance working within 30 metres, then you can save a lot of time and paperwork by consultants with personal licences. Similarly, BLICL, as we call them, the BAT Low Impact Class Licence, is another kind of class licence where consultants who have sufficient experience can hold a class licence and then simply register with Natural England when they exercise that licence, rather than applying for a site-specific licence every time. It's worth noting that licence applications aren't always determined very quickly, and it can be something that you want to build into your development programme, because it can take some 6 or 8 weeks to come through in some cases. We're talking a lot more at the moment about district licensing. This is a much more sort of strategic approach to licensing that was trialled with great crested newts a couple of years ago, and is now in the process of being rolled out across the UK. This is where local authorities can license strategic mitigation for great crested newts at a sort of district-wide scale. So rather than a developer necessarily finding a receptor site and translocating newts within or next to his development, he can contribute to a more strategic district level compensation and enhancement scheme, which hopefully will make things more straightforward from the developer's point of view, and could, if carried out well, deliver better benefits for wildlife. I mean, there's a few issues with that. We need a sort of coherent national strategy so that all of those district strategies make sense, and you need to have decent data on great crested newt abundance and distribution to actually evidence what you're doing. But that's one of the ways that licensing is likely to change in coming years. And similarly, Natural England have developed and issued about a year ago now their new licensing policies for wildlife, which they trumpeted as great for wildlife, great for business, groundbreaking licensing policies to free up money for long-lasting nature conservation. And these basically paved the way for district licensing and thinking at a landscape scale about how we protect species, rather than trying to fit everything into very constrained development sites. So if that's something that anybody's interested in, we can come back to that at the end and talk a little bit about how that might work and what you can now do that perhaps a couple of years ago wouldn't have been lawful. Moving on to legal issues around European sites. So we've talked about the SACs, the SPAs and the Ramsar sites that are protected under EU legislation. When you have a project that might affect one of those European sites, what we do is we carry out what's called an appropriate assessment, and an appropriate assessment, or a habitats regulations assessment, is required where a plan or a project is likely to have a significant effect on a European site, whether by itself or in combination with other projects. And it applies to any activity that's not directly connected to the management of the European site. So if you're looking after the site in a conservation sense, you don't have to keep doing HRAs for all of your management activities. if you're developing a site close to a European site, then you will have to carry out HRA. So the first stage is screening, where we see what would or could the impacts be, and an HRA will need to be carried out. You need to move on to the next stage of assessment. If the screening stage, it can't be proven beyond reasonable scientific doubt that there will be no significant effects. That's quite a high standard of proof, and it's quite a precautionary approach to screening. When you've moved on to HRA then, if that assessment finds a negative residual effect that avoidance and mitigation measures can't reduce to non-significant, then the rules are that consent should not be granted unless there are no alternatives, there are imperative reasons of overriding public importance, IROPI, and those reasons of public importance can be of an economic or social nature, and also that suitable compensation measures can be secured and put in place. So one example would be the Thames Estuary Airport. You might remember a couple of years ago, the Airports Commission looked at opportunities to increase airport capacity in South East England, and that's eventually settled onto the current proposals that are being developed at Heathrow. Now, one of the proposed sites that was put forward to the Commission was a new airport, an entirely new airport constructed on an artificial island in the Thames Estuary, not that close to Tower Bridge. But the Thames Estuary supports a number of European designations and based on an important assemblage of wetland birds. So building an airport is obviously not directly related to the management of the designated site, so it falls within the regulations. There would be a significant impact if you constructed an island there. There'd be a loss of habitat, there'd be disturbance to birds occupying nearby sites, and there'd be a risk of direct mortality through bird strike. So if we apply the EU regulations, then if you can't mitigate those effects to a negative, to a neutral residual, and a negative impact would be expected, then we need to decide, are there alternatives? Are there imperative reasons of overriding public importance? Well, and that was something that the lawyers dealing with this site and with the Airports Commission have tussled with long and hard, because are there imperative reasons of overriding public importance? Well, yes, certainly. You can develop a case saying that it's a massive public benefit to have a major airport in the southeast of England, massive benefit to the economy. Are there alternatives? Well, alternatives to what? There were no alternatives with the same capacity or scale, with the same access to the east side of London, and with the same lack of impacts on the human population near Heathrow. But there are obviously alternative airports, and it's some of these sort of legal questions that will spend a lot of time in developing these schemes rather than necessarily the ecological ones. So if it had gone ahead, the project would have required compensation for those impacts, and in order to do that, it would need to create, replace, or enhance alternative habitat to support at least the same populations of birds that would be affected by the scheme. If it had gone ahead, it would have been one of the largest habitat creation projects ever. And these are the sorts of issues that we're looking at when we're dealing with how to offset impacts on these European sites, because as you can see, there's quite a strong presumption against developments that affect them, and we'd need to put in place quite significant compensation to make sure that that network of sites right across Europe isn't affected, that by impacting one site in the Thames, we're not disrupting the migration of birds across Europe, for example. Now, another set of impacts around European sites that you might have come across are the issue of SANGs, Sustainable Alternative Natural Green Space, associated with developments near sites like the Thames Basin Heaths SPA. Now, SANGs they're not compensation measures in the same way. They haven't come at the end of a process and they're compensation. SANGs are not there to create alternative habitat for the species on the designated site. They're an avoidance measure. They're avoiding potential impacts on the designated site. So in this case, in the case of the Thames Basin Heath, the SANGs are there as honeypots to draw dog walkers and recreational activity to keep them off the site, to stop an impact happening in the first place. And that was long debated in public inquiries and in the courts, but is now settled as part of how we manage these things. And I'm sure many of you will come across schemes where you pay a SANGs contribution if you're developing within a certain radius of a European site. So that, at rather length, was the legal issues. These are the sorts of legal issues that we're dealing with when we're managing ecological issues in development. And I'm going to move on to the kinds of survey that you do. So if you ask me, when do you need an ecological survey? The answer is, sorry, probably usually, but the type and extent that you need might vary. If you're only doing a loft conversion, it still might be wise to get a BAT survey. If you're developing an area of land, particularly if it's green land, then you will probably want to do some sort of broad ecological survey. And there's the three types here. There's a kind of very preliminary walkover where you're just looking for a rapid assessment of opportunities and constraints. And that's the sort of thing that you might do prior to buying or optioning a piece of land, so you can see if there are any massive showstopper issues. I say showstopper. There aren't many issues that are real showstoppers, but if your site was covered in ancient woodland, then I'd probably tell you not to buy it. Then moving on to a preliminary ecological appraisal, which is an initial walkover survey where we look at the broad habitat types that are present, we look at the potential for different protected species, but we don't necessarily look in detail at any of those protected species. And on some occasions, that might be all you need. Normally, that'll be a preliminary step before moving on to more detailed surveys. So then we move on to the more detailed ecological impact assessment, and that's the sort of thing that I've been talking about, where we're actually looking at individual protected species in detail, finding out what the impacts on them are going to be and how we can mitigate those. And then, of course, after all of that, and you've got consent and things are put in place and you've actioned your mitigation plan, then there's going to be surveys that are part of monitoring to see the effectiveness of that mitigation, and also a requirement of the latest revision of the EIA directive, monitoring to make sure that your assessment of impacts was right, and we're learning and feeding back into future impact assessments to make them more and more accurate. So monitoring's there to find out what's happened, what the effects are, and to trigger action. Most importantly, if things aren't working out as you thought that they would or should, then triggering any changes in management that are needed. Different surveys, different ecological surveys obviously need to be carried out at different times of year. And I'm not sure how well you can see that if you're looking at your laptop screen, but if anybody wants a copy of that, there's lots of them produced by different consultancies. I'll happily send you one. But it shows you that, for example, you can carry out badger surveys, to be honest, most of the year, but they're better done February to May and September, October, because that's the period when badgers are most active and the vegetation hasn't grown up to obscure what they're doing. And you can see how there are lots of different constraints, so it can be difficult to program into a run up to planning consent, for example, to get all of those done, unless you have the luxury of a full year to carry out surveys. Most of us don't most of the time, but you can see that if you don't have a full year, then having a season of late spring and most of the summer is the most valuable, because most of the surveys that we can do are done then. There will be some exceptions. You might occasionally be able to fit some things in and supply information as an addendum. But what's important to remember is that the presence of protected species is a material consideration in determining a planning application, and so it's not usually appropriate for surveys to be conditioned. They usually need to be carried out before planning is applied for. I would say the exception to that is when you apply what I consider to be the most important test in ecology, which is the so what test. And that is, will the survey that you're proposing carrying out change anything? Will it change your layout? Will it change timings? Will it change what you're able to do? Will it change capacity? And if the answer is no, if the answer is, for example, let's say for common reptiles, often you'll see people carrying out 5, 6, 10 surveys for common reptiles, and you will come back and you'll have some information about how many slow worms there are on your proposed development site. Will that change anything about your development? No, probably not, because you could define what the mitigation for slow worms would be there and then, and the absolute number of them is probably not going to make a huge amount of difference. So in those instances, I would say that rather than conditioning a survey, you could condition an appropriate mitigation and habitat enhancement plan and just move on. So again, it's one to challenge and think about whether you really need all of that information each time. So let's move on to some of the specifics for different species, starting with badgers. Badgers are social animals. They live in family groups in sets underground. And so the main effects of development on badgers are loss of sets, direct impact on sets, disturbance to animals within those sets, risk of road traffic accidents, so collisions with vehicles, and loss of territory. So what we can do about those things, well, when we're working close to badger sets and we think it's not safe to retain the badgers in situ, then we can exclude badgers from their sets. So with using a combination of little one-way gates like cat flaps, badger gates, and fencing, we can get badgers out of their sets. It's important when we do that to make sure that they have somewhere else to go, and that could actually be an existing natural set within their territory. You can't move them a long distance, but you can move them around within their existing territory. Or it might be that we build an artificial set. This is a structure with pipe tunnels and wooden chambers built into the ground and buried under several tons of earth. So that the badgers can occupy that and have somewhere else to go. You can only do it at certain times of year. You don't do it when badgers have dependent cubs that might be underground and left underground when the female was excluded. And then we can look at keeping the badgers inside. There's what we call the mitigation hierarchy, and this applies to all of the species that I'm going to talk about, where our first line of defense, if you like, is to avoid the impact in the first place. Try not to have the impact, then reduce the level of the impact. Only once you've reduced it as far as you can would you try to mitigate it, and then after you've carried out all the reasonable mitigation measures and you still have residual impact, then we're looking at compensation for that impact. So that's the mitigation hierarchy. Those principles are the same for all developments, for all species. So I'm just talking a little bit about the actual mitigation measures when you get to that stage. Where you can, you try to keep the badgers in situ, and then you might need an ecologist to supervise works close to those sets. It requires an ecologist to understand how badger sets work, and so where the tunnels are likely to run underground, and allow you to do that without getting into trouble and having to stop and apply for a license. I mentioned when I said about impacts on badger territory, that obviously loss of territory is something that could happen. You might leave the sets in situ, but take out some of the land around it and build houses on it, for example. Here, there's a lot talked about mitigating the impacts of development on badger territories, and I see a lot of ecological survey reports where they carry out an exercise called bait marking, which allows you to plot where a badger's territory is and then calculate the percentage of that territory that would be lost. Again, I'm going to play my so what card. it isn't possible to compensate for loss of territory. For some species it is. For some species you could make habitat twice as productive, you could make a smaller area of habitat twice as productive and compensate for some loss of area. For badgers that's not possible. Badgers are eating earthworms largely, and it's not really possible to double the productivity of the remaining part of their territory so that it produces twice as many earthworms. You will have to accept that if you lose a substantial proportion of a badger social group's territory, then that social group will get smaller. It won't be able to support as many badgers, and that's just an impact that you're going to have to accept as a residual within your development. What's important is to make sure that that social group, if you're retaining it within a development, has roots out, that it's not trapped in a little island of suitable habitat, and you'll have to accept that it will become a smaller group of badgers, but hopefully if you manage its links out and you make sure there are green wildlife corridors, then it will still be a functional social group. Bats then. Bats are nocturnal, insectivorous, and they roost in colonies. Different species have quite different requirements, and they typically roost in trees, in buildings, and in underground structures. And different roosts are used at different times of year for different things. So breeding roosts look very different to hibernation roosts, have very different physical conditions. And the types of impacts of development on bats then are typically loss of roosts, destroying access to roosts, disturbing bats that are hanging up in their roosts, loss of habitat close to their roosts. So greater horseshoe bats, for example, are very dependent on having good quality pasture that produces insects very close to their maternity colonies, for example, and loss or damage to commuting routes as well. The linear features usually of how they get around their territories can be very important. So the types of mitigation that we tend to look at for bats are things like producing artificial roosts. So these might be as simple as bat boxes on trees, not effective for all species, but can be quite useful for some. Other sort of artificial roost structures like bat lofts, bat hibernation caves and so forth. There are all sorts of different structures that have been trialled out there, and we're in the process at the moment of updating the bat mitigation guidelines with some actual evidence on which of those sorts of methods are more successful and have more evidence of being worthwhile. And it's relatively simple once you've got those artificial structures in place to exclude bats using effectively a one-way gate on a very tiny scale to get them out of their existing routes as they leave naturally at dusk, and not allow them back in. And obviously again there's going to be seasonal constraints around that. You wouldn't do it at the time that female bats were flying out and leaving babies hanging up in the roosts, for example. You wouldn't exclude bats during the hibernation season when they're very torpid and energy levels are critical. We can do elements of habitat enhancement for bats. Things that are good for bats are things that will generate a bigger volume and diversity of insects, and things that will, so changing the grazing regime, in developing a more species-rich grassland, grazing with cattle, making sure your cattle haven't been treated with avermectins and so on. You can do you can improve connectivity of their habitat to help them get around their territories, so planting of hedges and linear features. And one scheme I worked on a pipeline scheme where we severed short sections of hundreds of hedges across a very long pipeline. We actually put in place the artificial hedge. So at night when no one was working, we put a sort of a structure across the gaps in the hedgerow breaches so that the bats could still find their way along their usual flyways. Because bats are quite plastic in their behaviour. They can learn to use new features and they can learn new routes and new flyways, but you've got to give them a bit of a clue to do that. You've got to help them to do that. And then finally, I've put in here crossing structures, things that mitigate impacts of road traffic accidents, say, or collisions with trains, bat bridges, and so forth. There's been a little bit of bad press around some of those structures, I'd say. The big green bridges definitely work very well. The little bat wires, well, maybe not so much. Gantries over major roads, possibly if they're put in the right place. And underpasses, getting bats underneath roads, seem to work pretty well. Great crested newts, they're our largest species of newt. They're relatively common in much of lowland England, but we hold a significant proportion of Europe's population. Now, obviously, they spend part of their time in water and part in land, and so you can require mitigation in both sides if you like. So we're looking at loss of ponds, obstructing access to ponds, loss of terrestrial habitats, and the risk of being killed on roads, for example. So we need to think all the time with newts about their habitat and their population structures. They live in metapopulations, so they move between a cluster of ponds. So we need to think of them at a landscape scale, and that plays back to the issues around district licensing that we've talked about. We can trap them relatively easily within ponds and move them to newly constructed receptor ponds. We can relocate them in terrestrial habitat using pitfall traps and fences. But these operations can take some time. They need to be done at a certain time of year. So obviously, if we're trapping out ponds, we need to do that at the time of year that newts are in the pond, in the spring and early summer. If we're looking at terrestrial habitat, we need to be looking outside of that season, ideally sort of into the late summer. We don't really want to be trying to do it in the hibernation season. It's very difficult to do that successfully in the winter. So again, it's a matter of building into the programme. Waterfalls, they're sort of an amphibious rodent. They live in burrows along the banks of rivers and canals and ditches, occasionally ponds. They were significantly reduced in numbers. They're coming back in some parts of the country now. Typical impacts of development for them are loss of habitat, either temporarily during construction or permanently, disturbance, and an introduction or lack of management of mink, which will eat them. Now, for a long time, we've worked with a method of mitigation called displacement, which is where we trim down the vegetation on the banks of the river around the waterfall burrows in the area that we're going to be working if we need to do a bridge crossing or we're doing some works associated with an outfall. And the idea is that the waterfalls will themselves move to the edges of that in the longer grass within their own territories. So we're not translocating them to a new territory, we're just pushing them along their own riverbank a bit. The results of that are actually not convincing, and some radio tracking studies have shown that actually sometimes the waterfalls are not displaced at all by that. They're just sitting tight in their burrows and not making any field signs, presumably because they're nervous about what on earth is going on. So typically, that might not be as effective as we've thought in the past. We use displacement in that way, and Natural England still proposes doing displacement in that way, but think of it as the first stage in a destructive search. So it's like trimming down the burrows, working out where the burrows are, and then very carefully digging the burrows out to make sure that you've got the animals out of the way before development goes ahead, rather than thinking of it as an end in itself. I'm moving on now because I'm conscious of time. Otters, I don't know where this slide came from. I rather suspect that's a small-clawed otter and not our native species, but never mind. This aquatic mammal, it's in Scotland, it's found in salt and freshwater. In England and Wales, it's only in freshwater. One otter can have a territory of 20 kilometres, 30 kilometres or more of river. And so it's, when we see signs of an otter, on a development, we're not talking about the impacts on lots of otters. We're talking about, potential impacts on one or two. It was once very endangered. It's still recovering, but it is coming back. Mainly, the main issues really are around pollution and persecution. The impacts of development can be around pollution, diffuse runoff. Normally more likely about hard bank protection, or about severance or fragmentation, so particularly culverting things, and then it's a matter of building in structures so that the otters can get safely under the road or under whatever the culvert is underneath, the railway potentially, at high water levels, at times of high water level. What's probably very important to remember is that otters don't live exclusively in the rivers. They will cross quite some distance. For example, in the spring, they'll come out and eat frogs in ponds or marshy areas. So it's important within the development to look out for those potential impacts as well and not think of them as very tightly limited to river corridors. We do see a lot of projects which build artificial halts for otters. They're very easy to do and they might offer an enhancement measure. I think it's quite unlikely, if I'm honest, that potential halt sites are the limiting factor on many otter populations. I think that's not necessarily the best use of your mitigation spend, if you like. Dormice. They're rodents, they live in trees, they're nocturnal, they sleep a lot of the year. The Alice in Wonderland thing is right, they hibernate during the winter, they can enter summer torpor in the middle of summer if it's very hot and there's not much food about, and they have very short dispersal distances, they don't move very far. So they're very sensitive to loss of habitat, to fragmentation of habitats. People tend to use, again, displacement techniques, so you can translocate them, you can pick them up and move them to another site under specific circumstances. If you're going to move dormice to a new site that hasn't got dormice, you do have to ask the question, why hasn't it got dormice in the first place? Is it not suitable? So normally we use displacement, very similar, removing the vegetation where they are and letting them disperse naturally into the other parts of their retained territory. The timing of year of that is really important because obviously you don't want to be cutting down vegetation when the dormice are active in the canopy in the summer, and you don't want to be grubbing out stumps of vegetation in the winter when dormice might be hibernating at ground level. So again, as I've explained, there are significant seasonal constraints around when you can do certain mitigation work, so not clearing vegetation during the bird breeding season, thinking about when you're going to grub out the stumps because there might be dormice hibernating in the coppice stalls, when bats are not active, and so on. So there's a lot to sort of keep in your mind and plan out that survey, and it's worth building in some of those potential ecological constraints in your program at the earliest stage. Now, net gain, I'll just talk about very briefly. Until recently, most projects, development projects, tried to achieve a state of no net loss of biodiversity or no net loss of value for nature conservation. That's clearly not working as a nation, and it's not just development. A very small proportion of the land in the UK is subject to development. A lot more of it is subject to agricultural management, so my comments are broader than that. But 15% of UK species are extinct or threatened with extinction. 56% of our species are in decline, and there are 165 species in Britain that are critically endangered, which means likely to go extinct, things like freshwater pearl mussel. Now, we're not meeting the government's obligations to halt biodiversity loss by 2020, and so the rhetoric has changed, and the aims, the intentions of development projects have moved on from just avoiding a loss of biodiversity to actually trying to give something back. There are some principles that have recently been developed, good practice principles for development for net gain. So these are: apply the mitigation hierarchy, so obviously try to avoid any impacts first, mitigate them, and only then compensate. Don't lose biodiversity that can't be offset, so ancient woodland, things that are irreplaceable, just don't go there. Be inclusive, involve stakeholders in developing what the best plans are, look at the risks, see how deliverable your proposals actually are, make a measurable net gain contribution, use a metric, try to understand exactly what the outcomes will be, achieve the best outcomes for biodiversity, so looking at a landscape scale more strategically about what you could do, where the best place to do that gain would be. Be additional, don't just do something that was going to happen anyway. make it a legacy, optimize sustainability, so looking at other benefits apart from for wildlife, looking at access and human enjoyment and landscape benefits and so forth, and be transparent and engage with people about it. And I think this is quite an exciting time in environmental policy and trying to develop schemes that can deliver this, which delivers real benefits for people as well. So finally then, just what does the future hold? What happens now? The implications at the moment of Brexit are that all of the EU legislation will come across into domestic legislation. That's quite complicated, will require a number of statutory instruments, and we're looking at a period of adjustment and transition, I think, where things won't settle for a few years. CIEM and a lot of other organisations are very strongly in favour of a new Environment Act that brings together our environmental legislation and sets the standard for the rest of the world by bringing in the best parts of what our EU legislation does and perhaps other things that are specific to the UK. I've already talked a little bit about changes in licensing policy and how Natural England are moving towards more district licensing, local strategies, trying to do things at a district or regional scale to deliver the best outcomes for biodiversity, and looking at whether they can simplify their processes so that consultants, if you like, can qualify, can prove themselves as being competent to do various types of protected species work, so that they can effectively accredit the consultants and not have to spend a lot of time looking up front at looking at every license application that those consultants put in, and instead divert their resources to looking at outcomes and making sure that people are putting in place the mitigation and monitoring that they said they would do, and that we are getting the right outcomes for biodiversity, which is essentially what this is about. So I think I'm finished there. I hope that was helpful, and I'm sure we should be able to take any questions now if you have any.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. So yes, exactly as Stephanie says, if you've got any questions, now's the time to type away and send them over to us. One that has come in, it came in earlier, and I know you did then cover this off. It was regarding the great crested newts, and you mentioned that there's actually quite a lot of them around. Are they actually endangered? That was the question, because somebody's heard sort of conflicting information.
Yeah, it is a common thing. It's really difficult to explain to someone who's got a massive problem with newts and they've got hundreds and thousands of newts all over their site that they are endangered. But yes, they are. It's that we in the UK are blessed, or you may think cursed, with a very significant proportion of the EU's population of newts. So sort of we're the stronghold of newts, but therefore it's reliant on us to make sure that the species survives across Europe. But what's probably more important, and sometimes I think gets lost in the way that we manage biodiversity issues, is that it's not actually the individual great crested newts that's important. If we're managing the habitat for great crested newts, then we're managing it for other species of newts. We're managing it for frogs and toads. We're managing it for aquatic invertebrates. We're managing it for aquatic plants. We're thinking about connectivity in the landscape, and we're doing things that are better for biodiversity and make better places for people. So yes, it's annoying sometimes when you've got to set up a massive mitigation project to move 6 newts, and those are the things that get in the papers and get bad press for what actually the intention. And I hope that the new approach to licensing, this idea of district licensing and contributing to strategic schemes that will preserve great crested newts and other aquatic animals across a district, will be much more positive in that way.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a question from Charles here. He's just asking, do you think we will ever legislate for buildings as part of a much wider ecosystem that might include bees and insects? Because there's a lot of talk, isn't there, at the moment about bees and their stuff.
There are, yeah. I think we're getting more knowledge about that. I think there's some really great examples of that. in London and in other countries in Europe. I've seen some lovely examples, and it's when we get more again, it's a more strategic approach, I think, to that within cities. At the moment, you see cities with planning rules that are allowed, every new building has to have a green roof, but there's no sort of coordination. There's no sort of, if you've got one new building with a green roof in it in an island of grey, it's not going to do a great deal. It's getting those policies that build it up at a citywide level. So you've got networks of green sites, you've got a strategy about how we are going to get the city to be more porous to wildlife. That's when they really start to develop. I think we're getting there, and I think policy is changing in that direction, but it's been a slow process.
And Charles has just popped in saying he agrees that it needs to be a citywide approach to it, exactly as you say, rather than just individual buildings. Oh, hang on, they're all popping in now, sorry. This is where I kind of try and read them out as we go. Let me just see. Okay, we carry out surveys for insect infestations in roofs. If we notice bats, should we then stop immediately and contact Natural England as a question? And what are the fines for damage to roofs? There you go.
Right, okay. Yes, you should. Absolutely, you should, because you could risk disturbing bats. I mean, the chemicals that you're using are probably ones that have been tested to be harmless to mammals, but you could still be disturbing bats in their roosts, so you could still be committing an offence. You should call the bat helpline, and they will guide you as to what to do next. In terms of fines, I believe fines are now unlimited after the recent changes in legislation, and they can carry a 6-month prison sentence. So really not worth it.
Right, there you go, Lee. There's your answer to your question. So that's covered off everything that's come in so far. So what I'll do now is I will just say to everybody that obviously this is the last webinar for 2017, but we have put together our programme for January to July next year. Got some interesting topics coming up. In January and February, we've got a 2-part series in quality. So firstly, we'll be looking at quality in design and then quality in construction. And we've also got webinars taking place on cavity wall barriers, BIM, and some other subjects as well. So links to that will be in the follow-up email that you get after this event. In that time, nothing else has come in apart from compliments and lots of thank yous saying, very helpful and very informative. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Stephanie, for your time and your expertise this morning. It was a very interesting subject for us to cover, something slightly different to what we've perhaps done in the past. But again, I think it's very interesting for people to know. So without further ado, wish you all a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we will see you all next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.